If you think you truly know your husband after 40 years of marriage, let me tell you, you don't. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table that night, the silence pressing down on me like a heavy fog. My husband, Julian, had just returned from another so-called business dinner. He tossed his jacket onto the couch, loosened his tie with a dramatic sigh, and collapsed on the bed without so much as a shower. At first glance, he looked tired, but to me, he looked haunted, like a man carrying secrets he couldn't confess. That's when I noticed it. His cologne lingered in the air, but this time it was tainted by something foreign, a sweet floral perfume I had never worn. My heart sank, and a cold suspicion coiled around me like a snake. As I quietly gathered his things, I saw his phone glowing on the table. Julian never touched email. He claimed technology was too complicated for him. Yet there it was, an unread message. Against every instinct, I opened it. The words punched the breath out of me. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." Dad? My mind raced. Who would call him that, so tender, so intimate? My hands trembled as I shoved the phone back into place, my pulse hammering in my ears. But fate wasn't done with me. In his pocket, I found a receipt, a lavish dinner in San Antonio, even though he'd told me he was in Dallas. That night, I realized my marriage, the life I thought I knew, was cracking apart. And deep down, I felt this was only the beginning of a much darker truth. The rest of that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband snoring beside me, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside me. My chest felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out my heart and left me with nothing but fear and suspicion. That single email kept flashing through my mind like a neon sign. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." The more I replayed it, the deeper the ache burrowed into my soul. By morning, I knew I couldn't just dismiss it. 40 years of marriage had given me one thing I couldn't ignore: intuition. And my intuition was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, setting down his breakfast: 2 fried eggs, buttered toast, black coffee just the way he liked it. Julian stumbled in, hair tousled, eyes still foggy. He sat down, muttered something about an important meeting, and sipped his coffee without looking me in the eye. His voice was too casual, too rehearsed. I forced a smile, though every fiber of my body wanted to scream. "Where are you really going, Julian? Who are you meeting?" But I bit my tongue. I knew if I confronted him now, he would just lie. And I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. After he left, I went back to the evidence. I'd already collected: the receipt, the email glowing on his phone, the perfume-soaked napkins from the car. Each piece felt like a puzzle, scattered across the floor of my mind. But together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. My husband had another life. That was when I remembered Mrs. Miller, my old friend who once mentioned a private investigator. My hands shook as I dialed her number. When she answered, I barely got the words out. "I think Julian is cheating on me. I need Thomas's number." Her silence was heavy, filled with the kind of knowing pity that only made the wound deeper. But within an hour, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas himself. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown. I arrived early, my stomach in knots. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries, normally comforting, but today it all felt foreign, like I didn't belong. I chose the corner seat, where no one would see my trembling hands. When Thomas walked in, he wasn't what I expected. Not the slick detective type from television, but a stocky, middle-aged man with kind but unreadable eyes. His presence calmed me, if only slightly. I slid a flash drive across the table. "This is all I have," I whispered. "The email, the receipt, the lubricant. I don't know what to think anymore, but I need to know the truth." He studied each photo without expression, jotting notes into a small notebook. Finally, he nodded. "Mrs. Roberts, I understand. I'll start following him tonight. You'll have answers soon." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Thank you. Please just tell me the truth, whatever it is." Leaving that cafe felt like stepping into another life, one where my trust was gone and my sanity dangled by a thread. 40 years of marriage, and I was now paying a stranger to follow my husband. That night, I buried myself in work at the bakery, kneading dough, stacking trays of bread, balancing invoices, anything to keep my mind from unraveling. But when my phone buzzed close to midnight, I froze. A message from Thomas. My hands went cold as I opened it. It was a photo. Julian, in his favorite light blue shirt, holding hands with a woman as they entered a candlelit restaurant. My eyes locked on the woman's face, and the world collapsed. Allison, my daughter-in-law. I nearly dropped the phone. No, this couldn't be real. I'd welcomed Allison into my family. I had taught her how to make our traditional flan. I hugged her like my own daughter. And now, she was sitting across from my husband in a romantic corner, her lips painted red, her smile radiant. More photos arrived. Julian raising a glass of wine to hers, his gaze soft and tender. A look I hadn't seen directed at me in decades, my chest constricted, a stabbing pain that left me breathless. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Betrayal upon betrayal. It wasn't just my husband, it was my son's wife. The destruction they were weaving together was unimaginable. At 2 a.m, another message came. A video. With shaking hands, I pressed play. The footage showed Allison leaning in, whispering in Julian's ear, making him laugh. They left together, his hand on her back, his gestures those of a lover, not a father-in-law. I watched it again and again, each time feeling like I was driving a knife deeper into my own heart. The people I trusted most were carving me out of my own life. But I didn't cry. I couldn't. Something colder than grief had taken root inside me. Rage, a silent, patient rage that told me, "You won't let them destroy you. You will fight back." The next morning, I hid the evidence in a drawer under old family photos. Photos of birthdays, holidays, all of us smiling. Lies, every single one of them. I stared at Julian in those pictures, his arm around me, pretending to be a faithful husband while secretly planning this betrayal. When he came home later, his eyes bloodshot, he mumbled about meeting a potential partner from out of town. He even kissed my shoulder lightly before collapsing into bed. My skin crawled under his touch. Minutes later, Thomas called again. His voice was low, urgent. "Mrs. Roberts, I recorded their conversation in the hotel parking lot. You need to hear this." I pressed play on the audio he sent. Allison's voice, sharp and ambitious, sliced through me like a blade. "Dad, hurry up with that fake contract. I want that bakery chain already. I want that old hag out of the house." My breath caught. The old hag. That's what she called me. Then Julian's voice followed, confident, deceitful. "Don't worry, Juliet doesn't suspect a thing. She trusts me too much." I clutched the phone, shaking, my heart shattering into pieces too small to ever mend. It wasn't just an affair. They were planning to steal everything I had built: my bakery, my livelihood, my legacy. 40 years of sweat, tears, and endless nights of work, and they wanted to erase me from it all. At that moment, grief turned into resolve. They thought I was blind. They thought they could play me for a fool, but they had underestimated me. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to make sure the world saw them for what they truly were: liars, traitors, and thieves. And for that, I needed patience and the perfect plan. I sat in my bakery the next morning, staring at the ovens as loaves of bread rose and golden crusts formed. To everyone else, it looked like a normal day. Customers came and went. The bell on the door chimed cheerfully, and the air smelled of sugar and yeast. But inside, I was burning. The audio file from Thomas kept echoing in my mind. That old hag. She trusts me too much. Those words weren't just betrayal, they were a declaration of war. 40 years of my life had been poured into this bakery. From the moment I opened my first tiny shop, I had fought tooth and nail for every customer, every contract, every expansion. Julian had never once stood beside me in the kitchen. He didn't know the heat of the ovens or the sting of flour-dusted sweat dripping into your eyes at 2 a.m. But now, he and Allison wanted to take everything. And the cruelest part? They didn't even hide their contempt. My husband, the man I thought was my partner, had called me naive. Allison, the young woman I welcomed like a daughter, wanted me gone, erased. That was when something inside me snapped. I wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. I was a survivor, a fighter, and now I would become their executioner. That night, after Julian stumbled to bed smelling of wine and lies, I opened his briefcase. Inside were papers, draft contracts, partnership agreements, and fake transfer forms. My hands shook, but not from fear, from fury. I scanned the words. They had everything laid out. Allison's name appearing on ownership transfers, Julian's signature ready to verify. They were planning to sign away my life's work behind my back. I copied everything. Every page, every forged document. Then I carefully placed them back exactly as I found them. My husband prided himself on being meticulous. He would never know I had been there. The next morning, I confronted him with silence. I served his coffee, kissed his cheek, and smiled as though nothing were wrong, but my mind was racing. I had all the evidence I needed: emails, receipts, recordings, photos, and now contracts. The question wasn't if I could expose them. The question was how to expose them in a way they would never recover from. Thomas called again later that week. His voice was calm, professional. "Mrs. Roberts, I followed them to a lawyer's office. They're moving fast. They want this bakery under their names within the month." A cold calm settled over me. "Let them try," I whispered. I started to plan. Every night, after Julian fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table sketching ideas on scraps of paper. My revenge couldn't be loud at first. It had to be patient, surgical. They had to believe I was weak, that I had no idea. The more convinced they were, the harder the fall would be. I began with surveillance. Daniel's old recorder, which I had kept since his college days, became my secret weapon. I placed it behind the headboard in our bedroom. If Julian spoke to Allison on the phone at night, I would have it. If he muttered in his sleep, I would have it. And I did. Within 2 nights, I caught him whispering, "Don't worry, Allison. She won't see it coming." I smiled bitterly as I replayed his words. "Oh, Julian, you fool. I already saw it coming." During the day, I kept up appearances. I laughed with customers, kneaded dough, delivered pastries. To the world, I was still Juliet, the devoted wife and hardworking baker. But underneath, I was sharpening my knives. One evening, I followed Julian into the garage. His SUV still smelled faintly of that perfume, sweet and suffocating. I opened the glove compartment, and there it was again, the tube of lubricant, nearly empty now. My skin crawled as I touched it, but instead of despair, I felt resolve. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I replaced it with something far deadlier: industrial-strength superglue. Thick, clear, impossible to distinguish from the original at first glance. I filled the tube carefully, drop by drop, until it was full. Then I placed it back in the glove compartment, wiping every surface to remove my prints. As I stood in the garage, the tube safely hidden back in its place, I whispered to myself, "Let's see how incredible you are now." But revenge wasn't just about humiliation in private. No, I wanted the world to see what they truly were. I wanted their betrayal to explode in the most public, unforgiving way possible. And for that, I needed timing. The opportunity came faster than I expected. One night, as I pretended to sleep, Julian sneaked out of bed to make a late call. I followed, silent as a shadow, hiding behind the living room curtain. I heard him whisper, "Yes, come to the house tomorrow. Juliet's traveling. We won't have to hide anymore." Allison's giggle on the other end was unmistakable. "Perfect, Dad. Finally." I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. They weren't even content with hotels anymore. They wanted to defile my home. That was when I knew exactly how I'd trap them. The plan came together quickly. I set up a smoke trap in the kitchen using a skillet of oil and a string attached to the igniter. One pull, and thick black smoke would rise, enough to make the neighbors panic and call the fire department. Meanwhile, the recorder in the bedroom would capture everything, every laugh, every whisper, every disgusting sound. The next morning, I told Julian I had to leave for a contract signing out of town. He believed me instantly, even looked relieved. Relieved. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't go to the bus station. Instead, I walked across the street to Mrs. Peterson's house and watched from her window. By mid-morning, Allison arrived in a taxi, dressed to impress, sunglasses on like a movie star. Julian rushed her inside. I pulled out my phone, activated the recorder, and waited. Their voices came through clearly. Julian's deep laugh, Allison's cruel tone as she called me the old hag. Then the bed began to creak. I closed my eyes, fury boiling under my skin. That was when I pulled the string. The skillet ignited, black smoke poured from the kitchen window, and within minutes, neighbors were screaming, "Juliet's house is on fire!" And right on cue, the fire truck arrived. My son Daniel, in his fire chief uniform, led the charge. My heart ached for him. He didn't know what horror he was about to discover, but it had to be done. Through my headphones, I heard Allison's panicked scream, "Julian, we're stuck!" The glue had worked. Their bodies were trapped, exposed, and helpless. Moments later, I heard Daniel's stunned voice from the bedroom. What is this?" The firefighters murmured in disbelief, some even letting out nervous laughs. The secret was out. My revenge had only just begun. I watched the street from Mrs. Peterson's front window like a woman waiting for a verdict. The smoke had barely started when the neighborhood erupted, shouts, the slam of doors, the metallic wail of a distant siren turning into something real and close. My chest felt hollow and full at once, a strange mix of dread and grim satisfaction. This was the moment I had carved out of months of quiet fury. It was also the moment everything changed. The fire truck skidded into the curb. Men in neon coats spilled onto the sidewalk, barking orders. Daniel, my son, jumped out of the cab in his gear, helmet under his arm, the same hard-set jaw I'd seen 1,000 times at the station. For a second, I almost called out to him, to warn him, to tell him I was watching, but the sound of my own voice seemed too small for what was coming. I kept my mouth shut. He ran toward our house with the rest of his crew, adrenaline making him move like a man in a dream. From the headset, the recorder rattled with every footstep, every tool clank. Inside, their voices had shifted from coy laughter to frantic scrambling. "Julian, what is happening?" Allison shrieked, and there was the sickening sound of someone trying to pull something that wouldn't budge. Julian cursed, low and terrified, a sound I had never heard from him before. The recorder picked up the panic, the rawness, the humiliation, and it felt like a blade. When the front door came down under the force of Daniel's team, the living room smells of smoke and frying oil poured into the street. The neighbors pressed forward, their faces a mixture of horror and glee that made my stomach twist. I swallowed bile and looked away for a moment because I couldn't bear the sight of my son's face when he saw them. But I had to know what he would find. Through my headphones, the chaos unfolded like a terrible, terrible play. A firefighter's voice, Daniel's colleague, murmured, "They're stuck, glued together." There was a stunned silence, then muffled shouts and half-laughs from incredulity. I heard Daniel's boots thud through the hallway, then his voice small, broken, "What the hell, Dad?" I waited for the sound of Daniel's anger, for the raw, volcanic outburst a man might unleash on such a scene. Instead, there was a strangled noise, like a sob cut off halfway. That hurt me more than any scream. I had not wished for pain. I had wanted exposure. I wanted truth. But the way truth landed on my son, the man who had revered his father, who had loved this family, was heavier than I'd imagined. Neighbors pushed their phones forward, capturing images that would soon loop on feeds and gossip threads. Mrs. Peterson, ever practical, filmed quietly. Her face was tight as she moved to the front, camera shaking. Nobody was thinking about dignity now. The story had the smell of scandal. People were hungry for it. I felt like a spectator at my own execution, and also the hangman. Daniel emerged with his coat dirty and his hands covered in soot. For a moment, he stood frozen in the doorway, like a man in an impossible dream. His eyes found me among the crowd, and for the first time since this all began, our gazes locked. There was betrayal and bewilderment and hurt packed into that one look. He had always believed in us, believed in the life we'd built together. This scene had torn out a corner of his trust. Later, standing in the corridor of the hospital, the whole neighborhood's whispers following us like a gray cloud, I watched my son move like a man stumbling through fog. He didn't speak much. Instead, he moved with a dangerous silence. When the nurse placed 2 thin ointment tubes at the foot of the hospital bed, sterile, clinical, they might as well have been torches lighting the last of Julian's lies. Allison's sobs were small and thin. Julian, for the first time since I'd known him, had nothing to say that could stitch our lives back together. People called it poetic justice, Others called it monstrous. On social media, the video looped and looped two bodies being carried out, stretchered away beneath a sheet. The new scandal splashed across feeds with cruel commentary. Father-in-law and daughter-in-law caught in the act. The articles blared. Comment threads nursed their outrage. Half the town lined up to condemn, the other half to congratulate. I got messages, some filled with congratulations, some with thinly veiled judgment. "You could have done it differently," one neighbor wrote. "Did you think about what it would do to Daniel?" another asked. I did think of Daniel. I thought of him often, but the image of him walking into that bedroom, eyes wide, hands shaking, was in my head like a photograph I could not unsee. He deserved the truth before lies consumed him. I had given it to him. What I hadn't fully prepared for was the depth of the wound exposing that truth would inflict. When the dust settled, when lawyers and insurance adjusters started circling like vultures, I sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table, the same table where this whole life had been built. He'd taken off his uniform, sleeves rolled, the man of steel who fought fire reduced to a quiet human whose face was lined with grief. He looked at me with wariness, and then with the gentle, hollowed concern that only children show their mothers after they watch something impossible unfold. "Why?" he asked simply. Not why did I do it, but why had our lives reached such a breaking point that it felt like the only answer? I answered with nothing I thought would make it right. Words felt small and clumsy. I told him how I'd found the emails, the receipts, the voice recordings, how each discovery had felt like someone opening a cupboard and letting light into a room that had been filled with dust for decades. I told him how they planned to take everything from me. I told him how battered I'd been, how betrayed, how the thought of losing what I'd built, of being erased by the two people I'd loved most, had hollowed me out until I was only plan and purpose. Daniel listened. Slowly, his anger softened into something else: long, slow sorrow. "I wish you had told me," he said finally, voice ragged. "We could have handled this without making it public like that. You didn't have to burn the house down." The accusation landed like a stone. I had to swallow it and live with what I had done. We did not speak about forgiveness right then. Instead, we talked about papers, divorce filings, transfer deeds, and about the business, the bakery that smelled like flour and memory. We met with attorneys. We saved what we could. Customers lined up outside the shop as if nothing had happened, or perhaps because something had happened and they wanted to show their loyalty. The bell above the door chimed, as it always had, and I baked. It was my anchor. The press called. The bakery's phone rang off the hook with curious voices and sympathetic ones. Daniel stood between the cameras and the ovens for a while, protective in a way that made me both proud and painfully aware of what had been lost. People had already chosen their sides. In the quiet hours after the storm, when the crowd thinned and the ovens cooled, I would sit alone and think about the years and the tiny acts of kindness that had once made Julian a man I loved. It felt like trying to read a book after someone had ripped out the middle chapters. Allison and Julian's faces faded from our everyday life, replaced by legal notices and the steady rhythm of flour being sifted. The divorce was swift thereafter, partly to shield Daniel from drawn-out public spectacle, partly because the evidence was overwhelming. Julian tried to speak to me once in the hospital hallway, a broken attempt to explain or apologize. I turned away. There was nothing to salvage. Weeks turned into months. Rumors settled into memory. The bakery grew busier in an odd, fierce way. People sometimes handed me cash envelopes at the register, tiny offerings of gratitude and shock. Mrs. Peterson visited often and would sit in the corner with a slice of flan and a look that said we had both survived something impossible. Daniel lived with me for a while, then helped manage the shop while he returned to his life at the station with new walls built around his heart. I kept thinking about the cost. Retribution had a price. The truth had been ugly and public, and the wounds it opened did not heal cleanly. But there was also a stubborn light that grew from the ashes Monday mornings in the bakery when the sun hit the windows just right. The little clink of cups, a thank you from a regular. I could feel myself reassembling, piece by careful piece. Had I saved my life and destroyed another? Had I protected what I loved by using the only tools left to me? Or had I turned myself into something harder to love? The questions did not stop. They sat with me like ghosts. But one thing anchored me. I had kept the bakery. I had kept my son. In that strange, brutal calculus, something like survival had been bought with a terrible currency. And as the town moved on to the next scandal, as headlines chattered elsewhere, I woke up each morning and walked into the kitchen. I kneaded dough until my hands remembered how to make something honest, something true. The ovens did not care about betrayal or forgiveness. They only took what I gave them: heat, patience, time, and turned it into something people could eat, and for a moment, believe was unbroken. When the scandal finally reached its boiling point, when Julian and Allison were carried out on stretchers with the whole neighborhood watching, I thought my revenge was complete. But I was wrong. That public humiliation, that firestorm of whispers and judgment, was only the beginning of what came after the long nights of silence, the endless papers to sign, and the deep, raw wound in my son's eyes that never fully closed. The divorce papers were signed in a cold hospital room. Julian's hand trembled when he took the pen, his face pale and lined, a shadow of the man I once married. He tried to look at me, maybe searching for pity, maybe for forgiveness, but I gave him nothing. 40 years of marriage collapsed into a single moment as I said, steady and unflinching, "This is the end, Julian. You chose your path. Now live with it." Allison sat across the room, her mascara streaked, her body wrapped in hospital sheets. She whispered to Daniel, begging for mercy, for forgiveness. But my son said nothing. His silence was louder than any curse. He turned his back on her, and I knew she had lost him forever. In the days that followed, the scandal spread like wildfire. Neighbors couldn't stop talking. Phones buzzed with videos, headlines screamed betrayal, and strangers whispered when I walked through the market. "That's her," they said. "That's Juliet, the woman who exposed them." Some spoke with admiration, calling me strong, a survivor. Others looked at me with pity, as if I were a tragic figure in a play too cruel to imagine. But none of them truly knew. They didn't know the weight of waking up alone after 40 years, or the sound of your son's quiet sobs in the middle of the night. They didn't know what it felt like to look at old photographs and realize every smile was a lie. Still, I carried on. I had no choice. The bakery became my lifeline. Customers poured in, partly out of curiosity, partly out of solidarity. They ordered more pastries than ever, praising my resilience, telling me I inspired them. Mrs. Peterson, dear loyal Mrs. Peterson, would sit at her usual corner table and smile at me like a proud mother hen. "Juliet, you are stronger than all of them," she'd say. And maybe I was, but strength born from brokenness is a strange thing. It doesn't make you feel invincible, it just keeps you moving when everything else wants you to stop. Daniel moved into the house after the divorce. At first, he barely spoke. He went to work, came home, and sat at the table in silence. Sometimes he would stare at the walls, as if expecting them to answer questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. I wanted to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I knew my son too well. He didn't want promises. He wanted time. One evening, as we sat eating a simple dinner of rice and beans, Daniel finally broke the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but hollow, "I'm going to help you run the bakery, at least until things settle." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I whispered. From then on, we became a team. Every morning, he'd review invoices and handle deliveries while I worked the ovens. Customers would smile at him, calling him a good son. I could see the pain in his eyes when they mentioned family, but he always nodded politely. The bakery, in its own way, gave him something to cling to, a purpose beyond the ashes of his broken marriage. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the whispers faded, the scandal buried under new gossip. People still remembered, of course, but the sharpness dulled. What remained was my bakery, my son, and the quiet resilience we built together. I began to find myself again. For the first time in 40 years, I wasn't tethered to Julian's lies. I started going to church on Sundays, sitting in the soft glow of stained glass, praying not for vengeance but for peace, for myself, for Daniel. I joined a cooking club at the community center, sharing recipes, laughing with women my age who treated me not as a victim, but as one of their own. It was in those moments I realized something important. I had survived not just betrayal, but the attempt to erase me. Julian and Allison had tried to take my bakery, my family, my identity, but they failed. I was still here, and every tray of flan, every loaf of bread, was proof that I was more than their lives.